Welcome to Lafayette We Are Here, the French history podcast by a Frenchman. Today we have a special episode. We have a guest, Thomas C. Williams, and together we're going to talk about the French philosopher Volney and the ruins of empires with a modern perspective. So please, Thomas, introduce yourself to the listeners.
Hello, everyone. I'm Thomas C. Williams, an American in Paris since 1989. Done a lot of things over the years, but from about 2001 to 2015, I worked in the political section of the U.S. Embassy in Paris. And during those years, I've also become involved with a French philosopher, friend of Thomas Jefferson, advisor to Napoleon Bonaparte. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight, Thomas Jefferson's anonymous translation of Volney's Ruins of Empires.
To start us off, who was Volney and what drew you personally to his work?
Great question. So, Volney was a lot of things. He was a world traveler. He was an author, politician, academic, friend to Jefferson, advisor to Napoleon Bonaparte. I came across Volney when I was doing research for a novel I was writing, Napoleon Invades Louisiana. I had that idea way back in the mid-1990s. And as I researched deeper and deeper, I came to realize this Volney person was the perfect protagonist for my novel. So over the years, I kind of became an expert in Volney and his ruins. And that leads us to where we are here tonight.
Doing some research about Volney, I quickly noticed that he's associated with a current of thought called Les Idéologues. Who were they, and what distinguished their school of thought from other Enlightenment currents?
The ideologues were a school of academics at the French Academy, the Académie Française, the Institute, and they all believe that our knowledge comes to humans only through our senses. If you look at the word ideologue or ideology, what it means is only the study of ideas. How do we conceive? How do we test? How do we accept or reject ideas? And that pejorative connotation that people have about the word ideology or an ideologue, right? That pejorative that the word continues to have today was actually invented by Napoleon Bonaparte, because these ideologues, while they first supported Bonaparte, later, as it became clear that he was trying to reestablish the French monarchy with himself at the top of the monarchy, they became his enemies. And so Bonaparte began to use the word ideology as a pejorative. And then a generation later, a certain German philosopher was looking into the history of the ideologues and Bonaparte. And this particular German philosopher realized that the theories that were promoted by the ideologues represented an absolute refutation of the theory that he, this certain German philosopher, was then trying to spread around the world. And so this particular German philosopher took Bonaparte's pejorative and spread it around the world. And that particular German philosopher, Karl Marx. So today, when you use that word in the pejorative sense, ideologue or ideology, that's really coming from the throat of Napoleon Bonaparte, spread around the world by Karl Marx.
It's interesting. It's not a couple of people you often associate.
Exactly. There was what the basis of Volney's work. He says it's very simple. Morals is a physical science. Normally, in today's world, we think of morality, morals as being something that, well, it's more like a social science. It's something that depends. It depends upon what country you are in, what century you're living in, what kind of background you have, or what religious school you belong to. But Volney says morals is a physical science. Just to give a small example, when you build a pyramid, You put the base on the ground and the point up in the air. Why? Because there's a physical law called gravity. To do the opposite, to put the point down on the ground and the base up in the air, would be a way of challenging the physical law known as gravity. What Volney says, it's the same thing with human constructed societies. There's a natural physical law that all governments, all religions, all systems of economics, all cultures must observe, must respect. And that physical law of the universe is the individual's desire to survive. Self-preservation. Self-preservation, the instinct to survive, is written into our bodies. It's something that we are given. We don't know where it comes from. It could be God. It could just be the natural order of things. We don't know. But just like when you build a pyramid or any building, you must respect the law of gravity when you build a society or a government or a constitution or a system of economics or a religion. You must first build those things based upon the physical law, which says all living beings have written into their bodies the desire to survive.
Quite interesting. It's funny because it reminds me a lot of other French philosophers who saw everything as based on natural laws. We as a society should try to emulate and acknowledge nature in many ways. And he has, from what I'm hearing from you, he had his own take on it, but it has the same vibration in my brain, if you see what I mean.
Absolutely. It's a follow-on of John Locke in England and other philosophers, philosophes in French. And what the ideologues, they were living in the era of the French Revolution. They were living in the era of Bonaparte. So the prior French philosophers who were promoting natural law were still in the era of the Ancien regime, so they had to be careful about the things they said because they didn't want to take it too far because they could find themselves outlawed very easily. But in the era of the first years of the French Revolution and even into the Bonaparte years, the early years, there was more free thinking was available. And so they could apply this natural law theories more into the everyday life of the French population. And hopefully, as the French were trying to spread that the values of the French Revolution throughout Europe, they wanted this to be taken up by other peoples and with an eye toward, obviously, overthrowing their aristocracies, their kings, their queens, and let's call it the conspiracy between the kings, the queens, and the various churches.
And it's interesting that you chose the example of the pyramid, because I understand that Volney, as a young man, traveled in the Middle East, and it helped in part shape his worldview and his later writing in Les Ruines. Am I correct?
Correct. And it begins this idea of Volney traveling to the Middle East, interestingly, with a suggestion from the very first American in Paris, Benjamin Franklin. Franklin was the young man, Volney's mentor in Paris when Volney was a university student, and he suggested Franklin that Volney travel overseas to broaden his horizons. And the voyage that Volney then undertook was travels through principally Syria and Egypt, and he learned Arabic. He lived there for 3 years, and during that time, he observed the destitution as the vocabulary he used, the poverty that was inflicted on the people by their rulers, the Ottoman Empire, obviously, on top, but also the local rulers, as well as the poverty inflicted by the Muslim religion itself. So he saw all of these things. He came back to France. He wrote his first book, published in 1785. And that was the book that made him famous. Travels Through Syria and Egypt is still a book which is highly regarded by modern day academics of the region. It's the book that made him famous, and it's the book that really began both his academic and political career.
So it was his tremplin, if we can say
Exactly.
so, into modern philosophical life. And you mentioned that he had the chance to express his ideas during the revolutionary era. So he was elected in the National Assembly in 1789. So what was his role in the revolutionary debates of that era?
Well, Volney was in that very first National Assembly. He was, let's call him, a member of what we would call today the center-right. At the time, a lot of people, they were using left, center, and right, but they were also dividing themselves between followers of Jean-Jacques Rousseau and followers of Voltaire. Volney himself, he fell completely into the Voltaire camp. So he was a well-known member of that very first National Assembly. One reason he is not so well known today is he did not have a strong voice, and he had trouble speaking before large assemblies. He was not one of those grand orators in an era before microphones. He stayed in the background. He got himself a job on the committee that was writing the first French Constitution. At the same time, he was participating in the writing of that first French Constitution. He was also putting the final touches on his book, the book we're going to talk about tonight, Ruins of Empire. So on one hand, Volney was holding the theory, the kind of republic that he wanted to create in an ideal setting, in an ideal world. That was the book that he was writing, Ruins of Empires. But then he was also sitting on this committee, which was composed of the aristocrats and the clergy, and he was a member of the third estate, right? Let's call it the bourgeoisie. And so it was very much a mixed or compromised document, not exactly what he wanted, but he sat on that committee, and that was his grand contribution to French history, is that he provided, let's say, two things he was most proud of was creation of the departments, which created the small counties, you might know, or in the United States, or shires in England. That was local government. It was necessary for people in the countryside of France to be able to take a day's ride on a horse to the center of their government, and that was the department. That was the idea there. And then the second thing he was most proud of was the separation of church and state, creating the separation of church and state for the first time in France's history.
Those are major, major contributions. I mean, the 1789 National Assembly, often that period is a bit overlooked because of the wars that followed, but I think the Serment du Jeu de Paume, or the tennis court oath that took place, and that was part of the formation of that first National Assembly, I think it's one of the most crucial elements in modern political history, when they decided that no matter what happens, we stay united, we represent the country, not the 2% of the clergy and the nobility anymore. That was an earthquake at that time. And Volney was a whole part of that. And then I can understand also fully why people don't know him today as well as they know somebody like Mirabeau, because Mirabeau would take the stage and literally take the stage. You could only hear him, whereas he was more cerebral, from what you tell me. And then he kept on working in those very unique circumstances, and he had a relationship with a certain Corsican general that we all know about. So what was his relationship with Napoleon, and what led to their eventual break down the line?
Wow, okay, that covers a lot of time there, and it's a pretty interesting story. It begins with, in about 1793, so Volney is a couple of years out of the National Assembly. The Second National Assembly has now taken over, and the deputies in the First National Assembly were outlawed from joining the second one. So Volney did not continue on in the National Assembly. He was a free spirit. He was getting back into academics then. But at one point in 1793, he takes a voyage to the island of Corsica, and he was looking to buy some land because at the time, the French sugar islands were undergoing a slave rebellion, and France was losing its sources of sugar and the income that came from that. So Volney had the idea of going to Corsica and seeing if it might not be possible to grow sugar there. And as he was going around the island, inspecting different territories, this young man started following him around. Of course, Volney was already well known by then. He was the new author of The Ruins, which came out in 1791. He had already published that prior book on Syria and Egypt, and he was a member of that very first National Assembly. So this young man who was following Volney around on the island of Corsica knew who he was and was very enthusiastic. He said, "Oh, Mr. Volney, you're so famous. Let me tell you, I know you want to buy some land. I know every place you need to buy. This one's good. This one's not good. You need to meet this person, this other person. You want to stay away from that person." This young man following Volney around was indeed the young Napoleon Bonaparte. So in a way, you can say Volney was the guy who discovered Bonaparte. And many times during subsequent years when Bonaparte's prospects, his career, were getting blocked, Volney would slip a good word for Bonaparte with his friends who were in the government. For example, like in the Directory, Volney was very much tied into the 5 directors, most of whom had served as deputies, as he had in that very first National Assembly. So he could always slip in a good word for this young Corsican corporal, later general. So that was the beginning of their relationship. And it prospered over the years. There was one part where even Bonaparte laid out the plans for what he was going to do as the general in charge of the invasion of Italy. And so Bonaparte just had a dinner with Volney, told him the whole plan, and then Volney got on the boat, sailed to the United States. Bonaparte took his army into Italy, and as the delay in the news, going across the ocean, the newspapers in Philadelphia would arrive week after week with the news of what was coming from Bonaparte's great campaign that was going on in Italy. And Volney was a member of the French expatriate network there in Philadelphia, which was the capital of the U.S. at the time. And so Volney, they would all meet in a bookstore there in Philadelphia, and Volney would make a prediction. He would say, okay, when the newspapers get here next week, here's what Bonaparte is going to have done. And sure enough, a week or so later, that boat would arrive with the latest newspapers, and it would be exactly as Volney had foretold. And all of his French friends, including Talleyrand, by the way, who was there in Philadelphia at the exact same time and who was a friend of Volney exactly at that moment, everybody was just impressed. They were saying, have you read the Book of Destiny? When in fact, just because he had some inside information that came from the horse's mouth, as it were. So that gives you just a little bit of background about how well these two guys, Volney and Bonaparte, knew each other. Later in 1799, when Volney was back from the United States and when Bonaparte had come back from Egypt, Bonaparte was going to engineer that coup d'etat that brought himself to power. Volney participated in that, and the day after the coup d'etat had been successfully completed, Bonaparte invited Volney to his study, and he offered Volney to be third consul. Bonaparte was the first consul, then there was a second consul. The third consulship was offered to Volney, and Volney declined. So then Bonaparte offered him to be interior minister. Again, Volney declined. Finally, Bonaparte said, well, why don't you become a senator? So Volney agreed. He became a senator, which was mostly a honorary type thing, especially as Bonaparte got stronger and stronger. But later, in 1804, when it finally came time for the Senate to vote the confirmation of the proclamation of the empire, that's where Bonaparte put the crown on his own head and became emperor of all the French. Volney was one of only 3 senators to vote against the proclamation of the empire. So even though he was the guy who discovered Bonaparte and helped his career at many times along the way, in the end, Volney stayed, let's say, loyal to the original principles of 1789. Il était un homme de 89, as the French say. He was always a man of 89. That is that very first optimistic period that you talked about just there a minute ago, Emmanuel.
From what I understand, he had no personal ambition. He wanted society to evolve. He didn't need to be at the center of that evolution, whereas Bonaparte had to be at the center of everything. But my understanding is that despite those growing differences, Bonaparte always kept the utmost respect for Volney and he tolerated him, whereas he was not keen to tolerate people who would say words against him, right?
Exactly, yes. He was, because of that early period where they had first met on the island of Corsica, and at that time, Bonaparte had even written a poem with Volney's name in it. Oh, Robespierre, oh, Volney. It was a part of the heady, optimistic, early period of Bonaparte's career, and he always kept that sentimental place in his heart for Volney that never really left. And yes, at a time when Bonaparte's enemies were disappearing, they were leaving the country, either forced to leave the country or they just disappeared into prisons, Volney was still tolerated, even though his opposition to the proclamation of the empire and the return, the end of the separation of the church and state, which was the Concordat. That was the other thing that was the big split between them. It was that first separation of church and state that Volney had achieved, and that very first French constitution was writ asunder by Bonaparte, and with that Concordat with the Pope, which included, by the way, a payment from the French government on an annual basis to the Pope. And what it was a bribe, because as history was later to show, Bonaparte had in mind the whole time he wanted to divorce Josephine because she was sterile and could not have any more children. He wanted to have a queen who could have a child, and then they could create that new familial dynasty on the throne of France with the Bonaparte family replacing the prior blue bloods. And so that was the whole source of their split. And there's even a rumor that's talked about in one of Volney's biographies. I need to talk about that. But at the time of their split, Bonaparte even kicked Volney in the stomach. And that was really the beginning of their split from each other. But it all had to do with the proclamation of the empire and the Concordat.
So Volney was really a man of 1789, as you said. He was that to the core revolutionary man with modern ideas, which Bonaparte was also at the beginning, and then we all know how he evolved and changed, and the circumstances also changed. So would you say, I mean, you partly already answered that, but if we look even further away, even after maybe the fall of the empire, would you say that Volney, for the rest of his life, remained that revolutionary at the core, or did he grow more cautious or even disillusioned with politics over time?
It's a little bit difficult to say because he was also, beginning in about the year 1805, 06, 07, he began to suffer from it was an undiagnosed illness. He might have picked it up when he was in Egypt. He might have picked it up when he was traveling in the Ohio Valley. He began to lose a lot of his energy. So he just had a physical problem that kind of sapped a lot of his time, sapped his energy. He wasn't as active as he was. But he did keep a foot in politics up until the very end, even when there was that brief period when Bonaparte was first overthrown and he was sent away to the island of Elbe. Volney joined the committee that was temporarily governing France. And so he was still trying to keep a foot in politics, still trying to support, even though France was surrounded by all the different courts, the armies of the different courts of Europe, led by the UK, obviously, led by Great Britain. He was still hoping, against all hope, that there would be some remnant of the French Republic which would survive a return of the Bourbons to the throne of France.
You mentioned he might have got this illness in Ohio. So we talked a bit before that he went to live to the States for a few years, for 3 years, if memory serves. So how did he come about to go to the States and to strike that unique relationship and friendship with Thomas Jefferson?
Right. In the beginning, they were introduced again by Benjamin Franklin. Franklin was the outgoing ambassador to the French Republic. And so he introduced Thomas Jefferson to Volney, and that was how they first met. And then in 1794, Volney barely escaped the guillotine, and he decided that maybe it's just time to go see something new, get out of France, maybe go live for the rest of his life in the U.S. And so he sailed to the U.S., arrived in 1795, in Philadelphia, which was the capital, as I mentioned before, and he became involved first in that group of French expatriates, Talleyrand and a whole bunch of others, and he was looking to perhaps settle there. This was during the Adams administration. Thomas Jefferson at that time was a vice president. And at that time, according to the U.S. Constitution, you could actually have a president and a vice president of different political parties. So because Adams and Jefferson were enemies at that time, political enemies, Jefferson essentially had nothing to do. He spent most of his time up at Monticello. This was when he was rebuilding his house, putting the famous dome on top of it. And at that time, a couple of months after he arrived, Volney went to Monticello and visited Jefferson there, and it's generally understood that it was at this time when Volney was visiting in the spring of 1796, actually. He was visiting Monticello. It was then that the two men conceived the idea of Jefferson translating Volney's Ruins of Empires into English. This comes from a French academic who was doing research in the U.S. at UVA, at Charlottesville, and also at Princeton, a Frenchman by the name of Gilbert Chinard. And he was doing his research work in the 1920s. And he discovered letters between Jefferson and Volney, which greatly suggest, but do not absolutely prove, that Jefferson was the translator of at least the first 20 chapters of a 24-chapter Ruins of Empires. And so that's where this first comes from, the work done by the French researcher Gilbert Chinard. So that's when this let's call it a conspiracy, really, between the two men, because by Jefferson translating Volney's Ruins, he was putting at risk his chance of winning the presidency in the election of 1800. Why? Well, first, why did Jefferson like Volney's Ruins? Jefferson liked the first 20 chapters. That's the political science section. That's where Volney uses that phrase that I mentioned earlier, morals is a physical science. What that means is that there's a single universal principle that applies to all countries, all centuries, all continents, all cultures. Volney writes in the first 20 chapters, empires rise if government allows enlightened self-interest to flourish, and empires fall when the reverse occurs. So that's the first 20 chapters. That's the political science section. In the last 4 chapters, Volney convenes a general assembly of nations where all the nations of the world come together. Each one of them gives their version of the truth. And then there's a big debate, a big fight. Nothing is decided. Everybody camps on their positions. And into that situation, a philosopher arrives and brings about a solution to the world's enduring religious conflicts. So that's Volney's Ruins in a nutshell. The first 20 chapters, it's the political science section. Empires rise if government allows enlightened self-interest to flourish. That's what Jefferson liked. What Jefferson was worried about was in those last 4 chapters, there's quite a bit of free thinking, atheism, or questioning whether or not God exists, or even if he does exist, it doesn't matter, because what God is showing us is that all religions must place at their foundation the right of the individual to survive, to follow their own self-preservation instincts. That's what God is showing us, or that's just what nature is showing us. So Jefferson, who had been pursued throughout his entire political career as being an atheist, he was worried that if it became known he was responsible for translating Volney's book, then this would put at risk his chance of winning the presidency in the election of 1800.
He was afraid of the scandal. And speaking of that, what kind of impact did that English edition of the Ruins of Empires actually have in the US? Particularly, I would say, in the anti-slavery or the free-thinking circles.
Right, super question. So this unacknowledged Jefferson translation arrived in the U.S., was first printed in Paris, actually, in 1802, and it was sent to the U.S., and it was a big success. It was a new American English translation. The prior English translation had been more British English with about a lot of ye's and thou's, kind of 17th, 18th century English. It was new. It was modern, this translation that Jefferson brought to Volney's Ruins, and it was an immediate success, and it went through multiple reprints by multiple publishers throughout the entirety of the 19th century, really up until about World War I was when the book began to disappear. So all through the 19th century, there are all these different publishers that were just reprinting without anyone knowing that they were reprinting the translation of Jefferson. It was still popular. George Washington read it. Abraham Lincoln read it. Frederick Douglass, the former slave and great anti-slavery advocate, read it. All of the abolitionists of that era were familiar with Volney's Ruins because it championed the idea that private property, the morality of private property, begins in our bodies. All right, what is the source? Why is communism wrong? Right? What did Karl Marx get wrong? What did Karl Marx not like about Volney's book, about the work of the ideologues that I mentioned earlier? Why did Karl Marx find it necessary to spread that pejorative interpretation of the word ideologue around the world? Why? Because Volney says the source of the morality of private property is because our bodies are private property. I own my body just as you own your body, and no one has the right to own my body just as no one has the right to own your body. I own my body and all the produce that comes from the labor of my body, I am the owner of. So this foundational argument was widely recognized as being a very powerful argument against slavery. back in that era, and was responsible for the reason why Volney's Ruins was so popular, not only among abolitionists, but among, as you mentioned, free thinkers in general, but also among women's rights advocates. So there was a whole movement throughout the 19th century that was people were reading, taking Volney's Ruins as inspiration. It was famous because it was like it removes the shackles of medieval thought, of religious dogma, and of an old style mercantilistic economics and the kind of aristocratic government of kings and queens which were holding humanity back. Volney's Ruins was like seen as a vision of the future by people in that era. And the ideologues, all of them, right? They supported constitutional government, Adam Smith style free markets, abolition of slavery, universal suffrage. So on the big, broad issues of that time, these ideologues, led by Volney, they were always making the right choices. They were always on the right side of history on all these big issues. And Karl Marx, obviously, when you say the individual is the source of morality because his body is private property, well, that represents right there an absolute refutation of communism. So not only was Volney refuting Jean-Jacques Rousseau and his social contract and all the related theories around it, he was also pre-budding the arrival of Karl Marx's communism. And so what we've missed, I think, Emmanuel, and this is probably one of the most important things I'm going to say tonight, right here, what we've missed as a species, as a society, we haven't studied Volney. We've studied Karl Marx, we've studied Adam Smith, we've studied Jean-Jacques Rousseau, but Volney has never been looked at from this particular perspective, and how many lives would have been saved during the late 19th and certainly during the 20th century had this refutation, this simple refutation of communism been better known. Would the communist revolution have happened in Russia? And all of the millions of people who died under Stalin or under Mao in China. All of this has occurred because we as a society, we as a human species never took the time to read deeply into Volney. And you can only say, really, why did Jefferson translated it? Well, that's kind of an endorsement. It was an endorsement of Volney's book by the third president, the author of the Declaration of Independence. What Volney's Ruins really is, in my reading, it's like an extended version of the Declaration of Independence. It goes deeper. It is built upon natural law, as you mentioned earlier, Emmanuel. It's built upon the same philosophical worldview that is constructing human societies, human organizations based upon natural law. But it goes deeper. It's much longer. It's book length. Whereas the Declaration of Independence was a super treatise. It was a superb essay that had universal influence and still does today. Volney's Ruins is the same because it's based on natural law, but it's a book length.
Goes much deeper into the same discussion with the same ideas. And it's very interesting what you're saying here, Thomas. It reminds me a lot back when I was a student at university doing my master's, we had discussions about philosophies, ideologies, political theory. And I recall one day we had a debate, the classic debate about the Cold War and communism. And I recall my argument was very close to Volney, not really knowing it, I said that communism was inhuman, not because of the death that occurred, not because of the camps or the wars and all that. I said it was inhuman because it goes against human existence, against what a human being is. It's an individual by nature. You cannot format that in any way, shape, or form. And communism tries to do that in some respect. So in my view, it just cannot work because it goes against what the most basic elements of a human being are. And Volney was basically saying the same thing, much more eloquently, but he was basically saying the same thing, that it just cannot work because that's not what a human being is. And that's part of what he was exploring in his book. Speaking of that, you mentioned a lot how Jefferson and his fellow Americans saw Volney's work, but I'm also wondering, lots of people know about Alexis de Tocqueville, the Démocratie en Amérique. That's often how people think the French judged the Americans in the 19th century. But how did Volney observe that young American Republic? What was his take on it?
Volney's take was he was going to be the first Tocqueville. His ambition was to write a book describing the politics of the United States. And in fact, it was going to be a 2-volume book. He wrote the first volume, but because he got sick after he was back in France, he lost his energy. He never had his chance to write the second volume. The first volume is a book called The Soil and Climate of the United States, which sounds kind of dry. What does that have to do with politics? But according to Volney, the kind of political system or social system or moral system that a country develops is first based upon where they are. For example, the Bedouin tribes of North Africa will have a certain set of cultural principles based upon their lifestyle traveling across the sands of North Africa, which is going to be different than the human invented moral codes that would be found in North America or in Europe. So to understand first the political system of a country, you have to know its soil, you have to know its climate. So Volney wrote that book. It was published in 1803 when he was back in France. It was published in English language, not translated by Jefferson, by the way, was published in 1804, 1 year later. And in the back of that book is one interesting chapter that does have to do with politics. And it had to do with also how Bonaparte came finally to decide that he had to sell Louisiana to Thomas Jefferson. And it was an essay that Volney wrote from his time when he traveled in the Ohio Valley, and he went to a bunch of French towns, some of which still exist, like Gallipoli still exists, Post Vincennes still exists on the Ohio. He visited the French settlers there, and what he discovered was that the French settlers in those towns, they were kind of lazy. Right? They spent most of their time talking and gossiping between themselves, or they were off chasing Indian girls. Whereas in the exact same area, the Anglo-Saxon settlers, they were working. They were in their fields every day. They were improving their fields. They were harvesting their crops. They were building their houses. They would improve the land. They would clear the land. They would improve the land. They would live there for 4 or 5 or 6 seasons, and then they would sell it and move further west and buy an even bigger place. And so what Volney observed was in direct competition, the French settlers, in competition with the Anglo-Saxon settlers, they were always losing, in effect. And Volney extrapolated this example that he saw happening in the Ohio Valley at that time, the mid-1790s. He said this is the whole reason why France lost its North American colonies at the end of the 7 Years' War. This is the whole reason why France lost Canada, why France lost Louisiana, and why France eventually lost control of its sugar islands, many of its sugar islands, is because there was of the activity of the Anglo-Saxons. And this is in that Volney book on the soil and climate of the U.S., but it's in the appendix. And speaking of Tocqueville, Democracy in America, turn to your copy that you have at your house of Democracy in America. Look up Volney and you will find him there. And there will be a couple of footnotes referencing this particular appendix, which you will find in Volney's book on the soil and climate of the U.S. So what we never got that second volume, which was going to be the book that Tocqueville, a generation later, would write. It was Volney had that in mind for himself, but he just got sick and he lost his energy.
Too bad. It would have been a very good take on it, I'm sure. I mean, and it's interesting that he did all the prep work with analyzing the country itself. I mean, it goes back to the image of the pyramid you first told us before. I mean, you have to know the basis to go all the way up. So you have to know the ground to know how a society can grow out of it. It's so simple and yet so clever at the same time. And that's what I often enjoy a lot about the French philosophers of that time, is that their views are not complicated to understand because they see through complicated concepts with such an enlightened view, a simple view, a natural view, and they manage to put those ideas and those concepts into words that anybody can understand and that anybody can apply to their own society. That, to me, is their genius. That's the way, and Volney is probably the prime example of that. You can have ground-shaking fundamental change without having the need for overcomplicated concepts or overcomplicated civilizations. You need basic concepts in place that hold everything together, and then you can build and then you can grow. And that's what these people brought. And speaking of Volney in the US, I mean, the US at the time, it was a social experiment, right? The American Republic is the first of its kind. It's embedded with the Enlightenment philosophy in many ways. But Volney was eventually forced to leave the US under the Alien Act. So can you tell us more about that episode and why it was recently cited by President Donald Trump?
Sure. So that's an interesting part too. Well, John Adams was president at the time. He was the chief of the Federalists, who were very much in the camp of the British. And at this time, the British still had the war ongoing with the French. So Thomas Jefferson is leader of the Republicans. That's not the same Republican Party today, but an earlier, different form of a Republican Party. Jefferson was more of a Francophile, and Adams was very much in the camp of the British. And so there was that tension between the two men, between the two parts of the country, that there was a British sympathizers and French sympathizers in the U.S. So the U.S. was very much split as well. This was also at the time when there was conflict between France and the United States. In the U.S., we call it the Quasi-War. The French call it La Guerre de la Corse. That's where the French government was seizing American ships on the high seas because the Americans had the second largest merchant marine after the British in the world at that time. And so the American merchant marine, mainly out of Northeast, out of Boston, out of New York City, out of Baltimore, out of Philadelphia, they were trading with both sides, but principally trading with the British. So the French government started seizing these supposedly neutral American merchant marine ships and holding them for ransom. And so this became quite a sore point between France and the United States, between the Adams administration and the Directory at the time in France. And so it was a very difficult time. And on top of that, Volney was already well known in the U.S. For his books, principally The Ruins. And of course, at that time, that new English edition, anonymously translated by Jefferson, had not come out, but the old British edition was there in the U.S. at that time. So people understood what it was, and all the clerics in the U.S. were militating about Volney's presence. There was a lot of the Federalists, and the Federalist Papers were saying he was a spy. John Adams himself believed he was a spy. And so there was the dual passage of two acts by Congress. The Alien and Sedition Acts is how we often refer to it in the U.S., the two of the things together. And Volney's name was specifically mentioned in Congress as being the number one alien in the U.S. at that time. What John Adams never understood was, well, yes, it was true. Volney was spying for the French government. He was sending letters back to his friends in the directory. But what Adams never figured, what never understood, that the letters that Volney was sending back to his friends at the directory were largely favorable to the position of the United States, and they were criticizing the position, the seizure of the ships that was being done by the French government. So that's one thing. It was a very tense time overall in Franco-American relations, and there's still fallout from that period today. There's still a mistrust of France and the French Revolution, dating from, let's say, when the terror began, but also just from the free-thinking side of the French Revolution, and also from this period when the French government was seizing American ships. So that was the beginning of the Alien Act, and Volney was ejected in 1798. After 3 years in the U.S., he was forced to leave. He goes back to France, and that's when he participates in the coup d'etat that brought Bonaparte to power. Now, just recently here, I'm just reading the news in the modern day like everybody else, and all of a sudden I start seeing these references to Trump using this old Alien Act to throw immigrants out of, and I was like, this can't be the same one. Because I personally thought, and I'm a political science student, and my first degree is in political science and history, I thought it had been rescinded. I think the Sedition Acts were rescinded, and I just always assumed that the Alien Act had been rescinded. But no, by all evidence, it's still on the books, and this is the exact same act that President Trump is using these days to throw immigrants out of the country. It was used against Volney a couple hundred years ago.
It's breathtaking when you think about it.
Yeah, and it's had no mention. I've read a lot of history in the U.S. since then. I've never seen it ever mentioned again. I thought it was gone.
Yeah, you would figure it is gone, but I guess somebody forgot to take it out. And somebody mentioned that to Mr. Trump, who figured it would be a good way for him to do the works he wants to do, whatever you want to call it. So, and it's funny because this podcast, as you know, is called Lafayette We Are Here, and there are so many aspects of Volney which remind me of Lafayette. They're very different people, but there is that bridge between France and the United States, which is truly fascinating to me. Those two countries are linked in a way that I don't think any other country on earth are linked in the same way. Philosophies, history, common battles over the centuries, despite all their differences, and there are many, as you know very well, an American living in France, there is something in common between those two countries, and people like Jefferson and Volney and Lafayette are at the center of this commonality, if I can say so. So, yourself, do you see Volney as some of a proto-globalist thinker, bridging revolutionary France and Jeffersonian America?
Well, yes. I think Volney's Ruins was written as a book for all humanity, really. Obviously, at the time, the two sister republics, the United States and France, and we were serving as the guiding lights, let's say, for all of the other countries of the era, which were still under the yoke of kings and queens and so forth. And so between the two countries, there was a similar effort to show the way. And Volney's Ruins, the book, is based upon universal principles, those natural law principles, those natural physical law principles that we discussed in the very beginning. All right, it is a book which can be read just like The Declaration of Independence is today read as a universal document by other countries, by other peoples, by other languages around the world. The universality of the Declaration of Independence is the same that you will find in Volney's Ruins of Empires. It applies to all humans. Empires rise if government allows enlightened self-interest to flourish. That's in that, let's say, late 1980s, early 1990s era, when it seemed like the world was just going to unfold with democracy and trade and happiness and light between all the countries. The Berlin Wall had fallen, the Soviet Union was no more, and China was next on the list. Back in those heady days, it was just like everything was going to be so perfect, as Volney writes in his book. And then since then, obviously, we've found that there's been some pushback, there's been some counter-revolution, and the old dictatorships, tyrannies in the old countries, the usual suspects have pushed back. But the universality of Volney's books does make him a proto-globalist thinker. And when you look at it like that, Volney's Ruins is really, it's based upon principles that he discovered while he was in the Middle East. So it's about yesterday, yes, but Volney's Ruins is also about what's happening today on this planet, and it's about what's going to happen tomorrow. What can we look forward to? What should we watch out for? What can we do to solve these problems? So Volney's Ruins, it's not just yesterday, it's today and tomorrow.
So now that we're in the last part of our discussion, we're going to discuss more about today's world and Volney's influence. You just said how relevant his work is still today. So one of the central messages of Les Ruines is that empires fall when they lose sight of justice and reason, basically. So how might that apply to today's global order?
Great question. So what's happening today on a global scale is that elites are taking over. They're concentrating more and more power, and they're dividing the populations against each other. There's this effort to take all power into the smaller and smaller number of hands. And that's what's really the wave that's going on across the globe right now. Volney says, the strength of a country comes when you actually expand the number of people who are participating. Empires rise if government allows each individual to participate. More and more individuals participating, following their own instincts, self-determining, self-realizing, living their lives to the fullest. When the individual gets rich, wealthy, and you have a whole country that's made up of dynamic, active, entrepreneurial people, in the summation of all those people, all those individuals, the country becomes powerful and dynamic and entrepreneurial. So you actually want more people. Look at the United States. We started off enslaving essentially an eighth of our population and disenfranchising 50% women. So we had slaves and we had women who were disenfranchised. And slowly, over the unfolding of the centuries, more and more people have been allowed to take part in the American experiment. And as the people who are allowed to participate, as that population grows, if the country undergoes a threat from either the inside or the outside, if you have more people participating, they will protect the system that protects their rights. They will stand up for the system that stands up for them. And that's the strength of an empire. It's not just when things are going right, when things are going good, but like when the system comes under threat. Look at what happened recently in Syria as an example, right? There was just that little bitty regime, a very small elite, and the vast population of Syria that were excluded. And that small elite had been there for decades, through a couple of generations. But there was really no underlying support for that elite in the population. Fewer and fewer and fewer people in Syria had an interest in supporting that regime. And so when it did come under threat, it was an interior threat, and it fell. So this is a perfect example of Volney's theories in action. It's not only about what causes empires to rise. Empires rise if government allows enlightened self-interest to flourish, but it's also about what happens when the reverse occurs. And if you wind up in a system, which is where I believe much of the world is trending these days, the concentration of power, even in the United States, it's happening. It's the concentration of economic and political power in a very small, increasingly smaller number of hands. The U.S. is putting itself at risk of undergoing another revolution.
Definitely. And when you look at American history, I cannot help but think of the other example that proves that when it's done right, that empire can rise and become stronger. And that reminds me of the U.S. greatest generation, the 30s and the 40s, when the U.S. came through, basically, to help the world. I mean, I'm oversimplifying, but when the U.S. came under attack, the way American society came together to face that threat and to fight for ideals, then they would then try to make available to everybody on the planet. You look at the discussions between Roosevelt and Churchill and de Gaulle and the ideals that these men put forward. They're the direct heir of Volney's theories and his ideas. And those elements, as you just mentioned, I'm afraid, are falling apart in Western democracies in some ways. And that brings me to my question, is that how do you think Volney himself would interpret the tensions between democracy and authoritarianism in our current world?
He would say that this trend toward authoritarianism that is currently happening worldwide is a return to the ancien regime, the old order of things. But the optimistic view is these are naturally occurring ideas. Freedom for the individual. Every individual is born with this desire to live free and to live fulfilling lives, right? And so it keeps popping up. Even if Volney's ruins, every single copy on the planet is burned. Even if the Declaration of Independence disappears, these same ideas will reoccur to future generations of humans, simply because there's that physical law of nature that says we are born with that desire for self-preservation, self-interest, self-love is what they used to say a couple of centuries ago. So what's happening now, it's difficult, and I'm not too particularly optimistic about the U.S. because even if President Trump disappears from the political scene in a couple of years, even if he willingly steps down, which I have doubts about, because he's already tried to do an insurrection. But even if he steps down, there are still these forces in the U.S. Some are secular, commercial forces. Some are religious forces, the Christian nationalists, the evangelicals, the hard right, and among the Catholics. They're still going to be there, and they're still going to be trying, and they've been trying to undermine the U.S. system at least since the 1980s, and maybe even before. It depends upon when you begin counting. They've been infiltrating school districts. They've been infiltrating city governments, county governments, now state governments, and now at the national level, they're infiltrating the court system. There's a far-right Catholic majority, 6 out of 9 justices on the U.S. Supreme Court in this very moment, and the U.S. is not a far-right Catholic country. Somehow that happened. There's the Federalist Society, as everyone knows. So there's an underground movement that was revealed by that Project 2025 during our prior election. And they've got some good plans. And even if President Trump is no longer president for whatever reason, those people are still going to be there. Personally, I'm not too optimistic in this exact moment unless people begin to read Volney's Ruins of Empires. That's the exact reason why Thomas Jefferson translated it. He wanted Americans to be familiar with the Enlightenment-based principles upon which the U.S. Constitution was founded. And I'm afraid that in today's AI TikTok world, we've lost sight of that. You mentioned the greatest generation. That was my parents, right? I'm a late era baby boomer, me. I was born in 1960, right? The boom ended statistically in 63. So I'm like the same age as Obama, right? But the early baby boom, they're starting to fade away. My parents are gone. My parents were teenagers during the Depression, and they grew up, they became young adults. And what did they get to do? Oh, lucky us. We get to go fight World War II now, right? But that shared sacrifice that greatest generation shared, left, center, and right, even though they still had very strong political battles between them. Just as an example, the political battle between Richard Nixon on the right and John Kennedy on the left in 1960, that was a very strong political battle, but still, when push came to shove, they would both, with equal energy, support the United States. That great generation, they're gone. My parents are long dead. And even the early years of the baby boom, many of them, Ozzy Osbourne just the other day, right, died. And so we're starting to go away. That shared sacrifice is really gone from memory. All we have now are books. And maybe this is the time for a book like Volney's Ruins to kind of enjoy a reawakening. Because it gives us, like you mentioned, you said earlier, it's like I thought of these ideas myself. It's just that Volney says them, more beautifully or more organized. I had the exact same thought myself when I was reading the book. I was turning the pages. I agree with this. This is perfect. This is exactly what I know. This is exactly what I've lived. This is exactly what I believe. This is perfect, except it was just better organized. And he was a scholar beyond whatever I would ever be, right? But this is so perfect. So this book, Volney's Ruins, translated for the Anglophones by Thomas Jefferson, is a gift. He meant it to be that way. Jefferson meant it to be an endorsement and a gift for future generations, just in case we ever faced a situation like what we have here today.
The answer lies in education, as is often the case. If people are given proper education, which should include a copy of Les Ruines, they would know how to confront these issues. And speaking of that, issues like populism or political polarization or even climate change, which should not be even a question nowadays. Do you think, to go forward with your idea, if people had access and would read Les Ruines, they would be better equipped to face these current issues?
Well, I think that the basic lesson of the Ruins is, trust your own eyes, right? What was the basis of the ideologues' thought? Where do we get our ideas from? Well, they come to us through our senses, through our eyes, through our ears, through our skin, through our sense of taste, right? That's how we learn about the world around us. So the basic lesson of the ideologues in general and Volney's Ruins specifically is trust your own eyes. Don't take the word of this or that podcaster that's, screaming conspiracy theories, or this or that preacher from the back hills of Kentucky who really doesn't even have a high school education, right? Use your own eyes to judge and to think and to reason And that would be the message of Volney today regarding all the things that are besetting our species today: the polarization, the populism, the climate change.
Volney did warn against the manipulation of religion or historical myth. In the US, something I see on the news often is that myth of the stolen election, for example, and that is used by politicians on the far right to do their bidding. So, how do you think Volney might view the rise of conspiracy theories and what we call post truth politics?
Yeah, I think Volney would look at that as part of the elites' techniques that are well known and well tested, that are quite effective, right? And the most well known being divide and conquer. That is, create false divisions between the people, right? You think like the Democrats were counting on, well, maybe we're going to get some more votes this next time from Latinos and blacks, as we have historically gotten. And that didn't happen this time, right? There's been a division. As that greatest generation has disappeared, the people who are born today without that sense of unanimity or shared sacrifice, they are more susceptible to being divided and being, let's say, taking votes which are actually votes against their own best interests. They just haven't perceived that yet. Although I do think what's happening now with the current scandal going on, people are beginning to reevaluate. Even many of President Trump's supporters are now beginning to see, maybe we've been fooled, or maybe he's been lying to us all this time. That thought is beginning to appear. I read one of my favorite pair of books when I was a kid was Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. And, Tom Sawyer is a kid's book. I read that when I was about 10, had a great time. I tried to read Huckleberry Finn like right after that, and it just didn't work. I wasn't old enough. So it was only like when I was in high school, I finally got around to reading Huckleberry Finn. And the most entertaining chapters to me in that book are when Huck Finn links up with those two British actors who are going around from small town to small town America scamming the rubes. And they're styling themselves as British aristocracy, and they're scamming the rubes. And Huck Finn, gets himself, he and the slave, Sam, was it? Anyway, they got involved with that pair of hucksters. And for me, that whole series of chapters of Huckleberry Finn was really about how the broad center section of the United States, what we call today flyover country, is really susceptible to being divided against itself into small little populations and taken advantage of. And that's still going on today. And that's what I see that what Volney would say, it's what's going on right now. It's divide and conquer.
It's interesting. I had the same discussion with friends recently that the first people who are betrayed and who are hurt by the current US administration are the people who voted for them. They're the ones who suffer first, often. I mean, the common people who voted for these people, and they are really affected by the political current in the US. And that brings me to my final question. If Volney was here with us writing today, what kind of ruins would he be meditating on? What message might he offer us?
I think the message he would most be interested in passing to Americans today, seeing what's going on, and that we are getting closer and closer to an authoritarian type takeover, would be to read those chapters of his book that deal with the decline of empires. And to that extent, I'm thinking of a passage from his chapter 11. So I thought I would just read that right now. It's chapter 11 from Volney's Ruins. It's the cause of the ruin of the ancient states. And this will give people, we've been talking kind of theoretically about what is in this book. So this will give your listeners an idea about what it is like to read Volney's Ruins. And this is the Thomas Jefferson translation. Chapter 11, Cause of the Ruin of Ancient States. Observing the spirit of egotism, which incessantly divides humans. The ambitious man fomented it with dexterity, flattered the vanity of one, excited the jealousy of another, favored the avarice of this, inflamed the resentment of that, and irritated the passions of all. Then, placing in opposition their interests and prejudices, he sowed divisions and hatreds, promised to the poor the spoils of the rich, to the rich the subjugation of the poor, threatened one man by another, this class by that, and filling everyone with distrust, created his strength out of their weakness.
It's so relevant, it's scary, right? But I mean, that's why we love history. That's why people should learn history. History doesn't necessarily repeat itself, like Santayana said, but it certainly can riff upon, past themes. And people should read. You never read too much in your life. People should read. People should listen to people who actually have studied and worked to understand what was written and experienced before, to acknowledge what was experienced, acknowledge what was discovered and understood, to prevent dramatic things from happening to them and their societies.
Yes, I think the last thing Volney would say is exact circumstances never repeat, but general principles do. And that's what his book is, Ruins of Empires. It's a book of general principles that applies to yesterday, today, and tomorrow.
A strong basis upon which, societies can rise or fall. So, Thomas, this has been a very, very interesting discussion about an often overlooked philosopher, Volney, one of immense importance that people should definitely learn about. And his writings in French or translated by Jefferson English is readily available. You can find it anywhere on the internet or your library. It's free for all to read. But where can people find you and your work, Thomas?
So, I'm an author. I've written 2 historical fiction novels, the first one being English Turn, Napoleon Invades Louisiana. It was doing research for this book that I came across Volney, and that led to tonight's discussion. So I've self-published English Turn, Napoleon Invades Louisiana on Amazon. You can find it by searching English Turn. Thomas Christian Williams is my name. And then I've also written a second novel, also based upon Volney's theories, but it's a completely separate story. It's called Cash Cachoo, 2 Ks, Cash Cachoo. It's also on Amazon. It's about the collapse of the civilization in Chaco Canyon, New Mexico, which was one of the most advanced Native American civilizations in the U.S., what is now the U.S., in the pre-Columbian era. It was kind of like the American version of Stonehenge, just to give you an idea. So my second story, just published recently, last year, Cash Cachoo, White House, by myself. And then if someone would like to contact me, I can be found on Blue Sky, YouTube, and Substack, all at the same handle. It's at Ruins of Empires. At Ruins of Empires, that's me, Blue Sky, YouTube, or Substack.
Fantastic. And I'll have links to your books and to your social profiles on both the website and the show notes. So you cannot not find Thomas. Thank you very much, Thomas. This was a treat. We enjoyed it. I hope the listeners did too. And I really appreciated it.
Thank you, Emmanuel. And you're doing great work like I said before, in an era of TikTok and artificial intelligence. Your work at Lafayette We Are Here is bringing to light the ancient friendship between the U.S. and France. Thank you. Bravo.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you all for listening. Au revoir. You can find the Lafayette We Are Here podcast wherever you get your podcasts, or on LafayettePodcast.com. If you enjoy the show, please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/Lafayette Podcast. You can also reach me on social media or by email. All the links are on the website. The music for this podcast is the Marche pour la cérémonie des Turcs, composed by Jean-Baptiste Lully, arranged and performed by Jérôme Arfouche.